What happens when Barron Trump steps into a homeless shelter and crosses paths with a boy who's lost everything? A single quiet act changes more lives than anyone expected. The air was biting cold that October evening in Indianapolis. The kind of chill that pressed through your jacket and made you regret leaving home. For most, it was a night to stay inside. But not for Barron Trump. At 18, his towering height and reserved demeanor often made him stand out, even when he tried to blend in. Tonight was different. He wasn't in a tailored suit at a gala or walking the red carpet. He was in a crowded SUV with Julia, a close family friend and advocate for the homeless. As they pulled into the parking lot of a modest shelter tucked between an auto repair shop and a small diner, Julia's mission for the night was simple: drop off a stack of donated blankets and check in with the shelter staff. Barron, who rarely spoke up about family outings, had surprised her when he asked if he could join. "I just want to see how it works," he had said earlier that day, his tone curious but measured. She wasn't sure what he meant, but she figured a little exposure wouldn't hurt. The shelter was nothing glamorous. The brick exterior bore signs of years of wear, and the flickering neon sign outside read simply, "Community Haven." Barron opened the car door, the sharp air hitting his face as he took a step toward the entrance. Inside the warm, crowded space was a stark contrast to the cold outside. The hum of conversation, the smell of coffee, and the sight of people bundled in mismatched coats filled the room. Barron paused for a moment, taking it all in. This was a world far removed from the pristine halls of his upbringing. For the first time in a long while, he felt an unfamiliar sense of stillness. Like the moment you realize you're about to see something that might change you. But he had no idea just how much this visit would leave its mark. The door creaked as Julia pushed it open, and the warmth of the shelter wrapped around them like a heavy blanket. A mix of voices filled the air, murmurs of conversation, a soft laugh here and there, and the distant clatter of dishes being washed in the kitchen. Barron stepped inside, his eyes darting around the room. It wasn't chaotic, but there was an undeniable energy, people moving in and out, others seated quietly at tables, sipping coffee or organizing small bags of belongings. A woman in her late 40s wearing a faded red sweater and an apron approached them with a welcoming smile. "Julia, you're a lifesaver," she said, reaching out to hug her. "We've been running low on blankets for weeks." She glanced at Barron, her expression softening. "And who's this? Did you bring me some extra help tonight?" Julia chuckled. "This is Barron. He's just here to see what we're up to." Barron gave a small, polite nod. He wasn't one for introductions, and truthfully he wasn't sure what to say. His gaze wandered to the far side of the room, where a young boy, no older than 10, sat cross-legged on the floor. The boy clutched a worn-out backpack against his chest, like it was his most valuable possession. His head was lowered, his hair slightly matted, and his sneakers were several sizes too big. Something about the boy held Barron's attention. Maybe it was the way he sat apart from the others, or the protective grip he had on that backpack. Whatever it was, Barron found himself staring longer than he intended. Julia's voice broke his focus. "Barron, you all right?" she asked, handing off the blankets to a nearby volunteer. "Yeah," he replied, though his voice was quieter than usual. His attention drifted back to the boy. "Who's that?" he asked, nodding subtly in the boy's direction. The woman in the red sweater followed his gaze. "Oh, that's Alex," she said softly. "Poor kid's been through a lot. Got separated from his family a few months ago. He doesn't talk much, but he's always carrying that backpack. It's the only thing he has left from home." Barron's chest tightened as he listened. He couldn't imagine what it would feel like to lose everything at that age. He looked at Alex again, this time noticing the small tears in his jacket, and the way his shoes barely clung to his feet. But Barron wasn't the type to act impulsively, or so he thought. Barron couldn't shake the image of Alex. Something about the boy's quiet isolation made the room feel smaller, heavier. It was as if the world had abandoned him, leaving only that worn-out backpack as a reminder of what he'd lost. Julia was busy chatting with the shelter staff, her laughter blending with the background noise, but Barron's focus stayed on Alex. Without overthinking it, Barron stepped away from Julia and walked toward the boy. His long strides drew a few curious glances, but he didn't care. When he reached Alex, he crouched down to meet him at eye level. Alex looked up, startled at first, his wide brown eyes locking with Barron's. "Hey," Barron said, his voice calm but soft. "What's your name?" Alex hesitated, clutching his backpack tighter. "Alex," he mumbled, barely audible. "Nice to meet you, Alex." "I'm Barron," he replied, offering a small smile. He noticed the scuff marks on the boy's shoes, the dirt smudged on his jacket, and the faint tremble in his hands. "That's a cool bag you've got there. What's inside?" For a moment, Alex didn't answer. Then slowly he unzipped the bag and pulled out a faded photo of a woman and a little boy. Presumably him. "It's my mom," he said quietly, his voice cracking ever so slightly. "She told me to keep this safe." Barron felt his throat tighten. The picture was wrinkled and slightly torn at the edges, but the boy held it as if it were made of gold. Alex slipped it back into the bag, zipping it up with care. "What happened to your mom?" Barron asked gently, though he already sensed the answer. She said she'd come back for me," Alex whispered, his eyes dropping to the floor. "But she didn't." Barron sat down cross-legged beside him, unsure of what to say. What could he say? The weight of Alex's words hung heavy in the air. Barron, who had always had everything he needed, family, security, comfort, suddenly felt small in the face of this boy's reality. "I'm sorry," Barron said finally, and he meant it. "That's really hard." Alex didn't respond, but there was a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. Barron stayed there for a moment longer, watching as Alex toyed with the frayed edge of his backpack strap. But something about this encounter left Barron feeling restless, like there was more he needed to do. As Barron sat beside Alex, the boy's quiet presence stirred something unfamiliar in him, a mix of helplessness and determination. He couldn't just walk away, not after hearing Alex's story. Barron had grown up surrounded by comfort, never having to think twice about what he needed. Yet here was Alex, holding on to a tattered backpack like it was his lifeline. Julia's voice called out from across the room. "Barron, you ready to head out?" He turned, seeing her wave, her arms now free of the blankets she had brought. Most of the volunteers were packing up for the night, and the shelter was beginning to settle down. But Barron wasn't ready to leave. He stood up slowly, looking down at Alex. "Hey, do you need anything?" he asked. The boy tilted his head, confused by the question. "Like clothes, shoes, anything for school?" Alex hesitated, his small shoulders shrugging. "I don't go to school," he murmured. "I don't have stuff for it." Barron's chest tightened again. He thought about the heavy book bags his classmates carried, stuffed with tablets, notebooks, and supplies they barely used. He thought about his closet, overflowing with jackets and shoes, most of which he hadn't worn in years. "All right," Barron said, his tone firmer now. "Wait here, okay?" He walked briskly to Julia, who was chatting with a shelter staff member. "Hey," he interrupted, his voice low so only she could hear. "Is there a place around here where I can get clothes and stuff for a kid?" Julia raised an eyebrow, surprised by the urgency in his tone. "There's a 24-hour store a few blocks away. Why?" Barron glanced back at Alex, then turned to Julia. I need to get him some things. Can we make a quick stop?" Julia studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "All right, let's go." As they left the shelter, Barron's mind raced. He wasn't sure where this sudden drive came from, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. He'd seen something in Alex, something fragile yet resilient, that wouldn't let him walk away without doing something. But he didn't realize how much this decision would ripple beyond that single night. The fluorescent lights of the 24-hour store buzzed faintly as Barron walked through the aisles, his focus sharper than it had been all evening. Julia followed close behind, still unsure of what exactly Barron had in mind, but letting him lead. He pushed a cart, his movements deliberate as he picked out items. A warm jacket, a sturdy pair of sneakers, a few sets of clothes in sizes he guessed would fit Alex. Then he headed for the school supplies. Backpacks, notebooks, pencils, even a small tablet he spotted in the electronics section. Julia finally broke her silence. "You're really doing this, huh?" she asked, her voice a mix of admiration and curiosity. Barron didn't look up as he grabbed a pack of markers. "He needs it. If I can help, why wouldn't I?" She smiled faintly. "Not everyone would think that way, you know." He didn't respond, but her words lingered in the back of his mind. He thought about how easy it would have been to stay silent, to leave Alex's story as just another passing moment. Instead, here he was, filling a cart with things that to him had always been basic necessities, but to Alex were likely unimaginable luxuries. As they approached the checkout counter, the cashier, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, looked at Barron curiously. "Got a lot here," he remarked. "Big shopping trip?" "It's for someone who needs it," Barron replied simply, his voice steady. The cashier didn't press further, but something in his expression shifted. He bagged the items carefully, handing them over with a small nod of approval. Back in the car, Julia glanced over at Barron. "What's the plan now?" Barron stared out the window, the bags of supplies sitting on his lap. "I'll drop it off tonight," he said. "Before he wakes up, I don't want him to feel weird about it." Julia chuckled. "You really thought this through, didn't you?" He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not really. Just feels right." As they pulled back into the shelter's parking lot, the building was quieter now. Most of the residents had settled in for the night, and the volunteers had gone home. Barron carried the bags carefully, making his way to the sleeping area where Alex had been. The boy was curled up on a thin cot, his backpack still clutched tightly against him. Barron set the bags down gently at the foot of the cot, making sure not to wake him. He paused for a moment, watching the boy breathe softly, before turning and walking away. But as he left, he couldn't help wondering how Alex would react when he saw everything in the morning. The morning light streamed through the high windows of the shelter, casting soft rays across the room. Alex stirred on his cot, groggy but comforted by the warm hum of voices starting their day. He blinked a few times, rubbing his eyes, and stretched his small frame before looking down at the foot of his bed. That's when he noticed the bags. His brow furrowed in confusion. He sat up, hesitating for a moment, then reached out to pull one of the bags closer. Inside he saw a brand new jacket, a deep blue, thick and warm. His fingers brushed over the soft material, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief. Digging further, he pulled out a pair of sneakers that fit perfectly, several sets of neatly folded clothes, and a bright new backpack. Alex looked around the room, his eyes wide, as if searching for the person responsible. His hands trembled slightly as he unzipped the last bag. Inside were notebooks, pencils, and a tablet, still in its packaging. He stared at the tablet for a long moment, not moving, as if afraid that touching it would make it vanish. "Alex?" one of the staff members called gently, walking over. She crouched beside him, her smile kind. "Looks like someone wanted to help you out. What do you think?" The boy's voice was barely a whisper. "This is for me?" "All of it," she said, nodding. "You've got someone looking out for you." Alex didn't speak again. Instead, he hugged the new backpack tightly, his face buried in it as tears spilled down his cheeks. They weren't the tears of sadness Barron had seen the night before. These were different. Relief, gratitude, hope. Across the room, Barron watched quietly, standing near the doorway with Julia. He didn't want Alex to see him, didn't want the gesture to feel performative. It wasn't about recognition or praise. It was about the boy sitting on that cot, holding on to a piece of hope that had been missing for far too long. Julia glanced at Barron, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "You did good," she whispered. Barron's gaze stayed on Alex. "It wasn't much," he replied, "but it's something." But Barron didn't yet realize how much this small act would inspire those around him. The ripple effect of Barron's gesture was immediate and unintentional. Word spread through the shelter quickly. Staff whispered about the anonymous donor, and some of the residents who noticed the bag speculated about who could have done it. Alex, clutching his new backpack like a lifeline, didn't let it out of his sight. He showed the items to a few of the other kids, his eyes shining in a way they hadn't in a long time. For Alex, it wasn't just the material things. It was the feeling that someone saw him, cared about him, even when he felt invisible. He began to talk more, his voice tentative but hopeful. He asked one of the volunteers about how he could start school again. By the end of the day, the boy who had once sat silently in the corner was smiling, a small but meaningful transformation. The staff, moved by the gesture, began brainstorming ways to support other children in similar situations. They reached out to local businesses, inspired to do more for their community. One of the volunteers even set up a small fundraiser, using Alex's story to encourage donations for other families in need. Barron, true to his nature, stayed in the background. When Julia mentioned how much his act was resonating, he simply shrugged. "I didn't do it for that," he said. "I just wanted to help him." But Julia wasn't so quick to brush it off. "You don't realize how far something like this goes," she said, her voice steady. "It's not just about the things you gave him. It's about what you showed him and everyone else, that people still care." Barron mulled over her words, not entirely sure how to respond. He wasn't used to being at the center of something meaningful outside of his family's name. Yet seeing the joy and hope that radiated from Alex, he couldn't deny the quiet pride that settled in his chest. But he still didn't fully grasp how much that single night would change his own perspective. Later that evening, as the SUV rolled through the streets of Indianapolis, Barron sat quietly in the passenger seat. Julia drove with her usual calm demeanor, but every now and then, she glanced at him, sensing the wheels turning in his mind. "You've been quiet," she finally said. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Barron leaned his elbow against the window, his gaze fixed on the passing lights. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "It just feels like I could have done more." Julia raised an eyebrow. "More? You gave that boy a piece of his life back. Do you know how many people would have walked past him without a second thought?" He shook his head, his voice low. "It's not just about Alex. It's everyone in that shelter. They all have stories, things they've lost. I didn't realize how many people out there are struggling like that." Julia smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "Most people don't until they see it up close. But you did something a lot of people don't. You cared enough to act. And that's the start of something bigger." Barron sat back, letting her words sink in. He thought about the way Alex's face had lit up, the quiet gratitude that had filled the room. He thought about the lives he'd crossed paths with that night, lives he'd never have seen if he hadn't walked into that shelter. For the first time, he felt a small shift in himself. He had grown up with everything handed to him. But this was different. This was about giving, not receiving. And it felt better than anything money could buy. But little did Barron know, this night wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of his journey toward understanding what truly mattered. The following days brought clarity for Barron. His quiet act of kindness at the shelter had stirred something deeper in him, a recognition of privilege and a newfound responsibility to use it for good. It wasn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It was about the small, meaningful ways one person could touch another's life. For Alex, the change was tangible. The new clothes and supplies were more than just objects. They were symbols of hope and possibility. His newfound confidence sparked a ripple effect in the shelter. Other children began to dream of possibilities. The staff found renewed energy in their work, and the community began to take notice. But for Barron, the lesson was clear. Kindness isn't about the scale of what you give, but the intention behind it. It's about seeing someone who feels invisible and showing them that they matter. And in doing so, you discover something about yourself, your capacity for empathy, growth, and connection. Sometimes, Julia told him, as they reflected on the night, it's not about changing the world all at once. It's about changing one person's world. And you did that. Barron didn't respond, but he didn't need to. The truth of her words stayed with him, becoming a quiet mantra that shaped how he viewed his place in the world. Stories like these remind us of the power of small, thoughtful actions. You don't need fame, fortune, or influence to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to care and the willingness to act. What would the world look like if we all did the same? If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on how you can be someone's light in the dark. Whether it's a kind word, a helping hand, or just listening, the impact you make could be greater than you ever imagined.